Compensation is more complex than you may think. How do you determine what is the right level of compensation for a given position and that it's fair and equitable, and if it considers external factors, and so many more questions? This week's guest is Sarah Lieberman, Partner and Chief Human Relations Officer at the CEO's right hand. Learn more about compensation and what you need to know in this episode.
Well, Sarah, it is great to have you on the podcast today. And we're talking about a topic that I think is so complicated for many, many firms. And you have a lot of expertise here. So thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
What are some of the biggest mistakes that firms make in compensation?
Oh gosh. Well, I think the top one would be not having a compensation strategy, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then I guess if you do have a compensation strategy, not having a good communication plan around that strategy internally, and certainly not having that well documented and having a consistent sort of administration around the process would be the top ones that come to mind for me.
Okay. And especially today, it's more complicated, I think, especially for our listeners. Many are small firms. They're probably under 10 people. Sometimes under 5 people. So having a communication strategy and a policy, that is probably something they've never even thought about. So what does that entail? Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, I think for a smaller firm, it's a little bit less complex, depending on how they want to structure things and what they want to do. But really, it's about making sure that everybody who is being compensated, whether it's their base salary, their incentive compensation, their benefits, PTO, I like to think of compensation in terms of fully kind of total rewards, everything that an organization is providing to the employee, that is well communicated. And one way to do that, first and foremost, is through offer letters. You want to say in the offer letter what type of compensation someone will get in terms of their salary and incentive comp, PTO. And then additionally through their policies and their employee handbooks, right? So that it's well spelled out. If you have sales individuals that are on board, it's important that those individuals have a written commission plan so that they understand how that gets paid out and what targets they need to hit and when that's going to be paid out. If an organization decides that they want to have a more formalized incentive compensation structure and tie that compensation structure to performance, that also needs to be well spelled out. So individuals know if I'm going to be bonused, as an example, that those bonuses are going to be paid once a year or twice a year, or what targets do I need to hit in order for that bonus to be paid out? What is that bonus actually dependent on, right? Because we could have discretionary bonuses and non-discretionary bonuses. And what does that mean? So whether you have one individual or whether you have 5 or whether you have 50, the things that matter to them always in terms of their compensation are the same. So making sure that everybody's aware of how all of that is going to be running and at what pace and what targets is really important.
It's so hard to keep it all just together, especially if you have several people on your team.
Yeah.
So how do you attract and keep employees in today's competitive environment?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think it depends on a number of things. It depends on culture, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Obviously, the total rewards that I've mentioned, career progression, and recognition. Right. So if you are an employer and you're going out there to recruit for employees, what's going to be attractive to those employees is what kind of company are you? Are you a mission-driven organization? what are your values? What's important? What type of an environment is that person likely going to be coming into? And will they like that environment? And so it's almost like a marriage. You want to make sure that you are attracting the right employees for your environment, because you're not going to be all things to all people. So that employer proposition has to speak to that segment of population that you are trying to attract. That's really, really important. So I always say to employers, there's so many different ways that you can get your messaging out there. And one of the best ways is to have raving fans in your existing employees. So, you might have heard of Glassdoor or LinkedIn or all sorts of social media. Well, to the extent that your employees feel comfortable sort of shouting your praises on social media, that's a really great way of establishing your employer brand, right? That tells employees, wow, this is a great environment, and likely I would like working here. The other thing is, I know that we talk about compensation, but career progression is also very important, right? So depending on the type of employee that you are attracting and where they are in their career, it's important for them to understand what is their longevity? What is their career path within the organization? So to the extent that you could onboard that employee and really show them, hey, so this is what we think of how you're going to kind of go through the organization, and this is what you could expect, and this is how we're going to assist you, and these are the kinds of ways that we're going to help you figure out your own development plan, and help you sort of realize your own career goals. That speaks to a lot. And so then obviously also recognizing the accomplishments of employees. And that could be financial, obviously, through compensation, but that could also be in terms of what type of an environment are you offering, whether there's flexibility there, whether somebody can work from home, whether there are other sort of incentives that are available, mental health things become very important, and those types of things. So really understanding what's important to your employee population and providing that is a really great way of sort of attracting, and then also through the culture, retaining those employees, right? Obviously having managers that are caring and communicate well and are able to be servant leaders and are able to mentor and coach, having an environment where people feel comfortable kind of bringing themselves into the environment, and feel comfortable, and equity and inclusion really, really important.
Mm-hmm. I think so. And especially today, it has become even more important to people to be a part of that, and also to feel like they're part of a company that gives back and cares about things other than just money. So
Yep.
I have seen that a lot in companies when they have been talking a lot about budgets, and their employees start thinking, is this all that they think about, is just how much money they're bringing in? So I'm glad you brought those ideas up. So when does it make sense to evaluate the compensation structure of a business?
Yeah, so I think we should be evaluating it on a regular basis, but certainly I think as the business grows and as the executive team starts thinking about sort of the business strategy and what are those business goals and what are we trying to achieve, what are those short-term and those long-term goals, compensation begins to play a really big role in that, because employees are the biggest expense of any business, right? So really making sure that that strategy plays with whatever's going on within the business. Are you planning on expanding into different geographies? Are you planning on hiring, a specialized subset of employees? Are you planning on going international? What are your growth plans for the year, and what are those costs? All of that sort of abut against that compensation strategy, and how you build it and what's going to be necessary is going to depend largely on the needs of that business. That's always sort of that first step when we're thinking about creating any sort of comp structure or strategy, because it has to play within what's going on and what are we going to be doing for the next year, 18 months, 5 years, et cetera. Because it's many times people driven.
I have a question for you that kind of came up the other day, and I was thinking about, I didn't have an answer for this, so it's great that we're having this conversation today. And that is that if you will have a small company and you're trying to look at what the compensation is out in the marketplace, and you go to Glassdoor, you go to Indeed or any of those online sites, and you put in the job description, it's basically a price range for that particular job nationwide. But that doesn't really take into account whether it's a small or a large business. So is there any way to know how to adjust that for a smaller business?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think it's hard when you're doing one-off kind of salary comparisons. You really want to make sure that you're looking at the right source, because a lot of the information that you find online is employee-driven information, meaning employees go in and they put in their own salaries. And you never know to what degree that information is sort of correct or incorrect. So it's important that if you, depending on industry, maybe belong to some sort of industry, society, et cetera, that you try to find salary surveys that are more keenly designed towards that purpose, or use sort of databases, because they are out there, but they do cost money to get a subscription to them, that are more employer representative. Most databases, whether it's, ERI or whether it's, salary.com or some other ones that are out there that you pay a subscription for, will generally take into account the revenue of the business. And that's important, because a business that's 300,000 people is going to have more buying power, obviously, than a business that's 3 people. So those revenues are going to be important. However, I will say this, because competition doesn't sleep, so to speak. It doesn't really matter, because if you're a little guy competing with, let's say, a Microsoft or a Google or whatever, you're still in competition for that same talent, which means that if you want that superstar for those positions, you will likely have to rise in order to attract that level of individual, in order for them to jump and come to your organization. So sometimes, no matter what the revenues are, even though they help equalize things, you're still going to be competing for that same talent, which means that depending on, where that talent comes from and what you need, you might still need to compete with a company larger than you for that specific role.
And that can be really scary for small firms that are a few, $1 million to $5 million. They just don't have the ability to pay at that scale of the larger corporations. So I guess it just means that it's harder for you to attract those people that may be those A players.
Yeah, sometimes for certain roles, it's very, very competitive. Or another way of looking at it is, to what degree do you need that role full time? Is it possible for you to get a fractional resource for that role? Is it possible for you to get that person part time? Is it possible for you to find that talent abroad or, in a different market? And those are some ways that employers are sort of potentially able to get more creative in getting the talent that they need. If local talent is so expensive, looking for it elsewhere is another option. Sometimes you can't do that depending on position and industry, but sometimes you can.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay. Here's a big question. This one is very common. A lot of our clients ask this. What is typical for a percentage of increase for raises these days? Especially we've had inflation, and during the last couple of years, people have had to give big raises for people to pay their bills.
Yeah, so according to Mercer, I always like to use different surveys because they capture a large swath sort of the population. So according to Mercer, and they did their survey, it came out in December, but they were looking towards 2024 and polling a whole bunch of employers. The increase this year is supposed to be somewhere between 3.5 to 3.8, depending on whether it's an adjustment or it's a merit increase. But it's somewhere along those lines, somewhere between a 3.5 and a 3.8, according to that survey.
Interesting.
Yeah, just as a data point, right? Because sure. I think everybody's situation is different, and you're of course going to compensate based on what the company can afford. But just looking at levels of inflation and the economic data out there, that seems to be the number.
Interesting. And in this, and it's great to have this data. Thank you for sharing that. And in terms of maybe you can't offer a really high bump to somebody who has been working really hard and doing a really great job, what would you do in that case? How do you keep them interested in staying with your company, even if you can't hit those big numbers that they'd like to see?
Yeah, so the question becomes, are you thinking of it in terms of short-term or long-term, right? So one way is to say, okay, if I don't want to promise somebody a salary increase kind of year over year through an adjustment or merit, because that would increase their compensation sort of year over year. Sure. One way of potentially doing that is to provide a one-time bonus, right? And so that it gives you a little bit more flexibility where you don't increase their salary, but you are potentially giving them some sort of compensation towards that. And it's a good way of also recognizing someone's contribution is through a bonus and not necessarily through a salary increase. Another way of looking at it also is it's not always about compensation. Sometimes it's about flexibility. Maybe you can offer that employee more flexibility in the way that they do their work, more time off. Maybe you can offer them something more creative, maybe healthcare for their more contributions towards healthcare, or more some sort of other incentive like daycare for their children, or some other recognition that would show them that you really value what they are doing. Maybe you could do it with by providing them some sort of developmental course that they've always wanted. Or, thinking along the lines of like a more of a profit sharing plan, which you'd have to do across the board and not just for the employee, but it allows a little bit more flexibility in how you fund it and over what time. And that way the employee feels like they're getting some sort of a contribution, but you're not beholden to doing it sort of immediately in terms of funding. So those are just some of other kind of creative ways of thinking through rewarding someone for the work that they're doing.
Sure. And I think it's a big question for a lot of people because when they, and I'll have to tell you this funny story. I have a client that when I first started coaching her, she told me, oh, yeah, I gave bonuses this year to my team. So I went to the bank and I got out whatever the cash was. It was a lot, it was in the 5 figures. And she said, I put it in a paper bag and gave that to each of them. And I was absolutely stunned. And I said, you did? Don't do that again. It was so funny. We still laugh about it to this day. But she didn't have a formal policy, but she felt like at Christmas time, they just needed to have cash to go spend money on Christmas. So I guess that brings me to the question of how and when should one offer bonuses, and should they do bonuses or should they do profit sharing? And if so, what are some of the things to think about so that you're not giving people sacks of money?
So I think bonuses are great, and they could be utilized for a lot of different things. You just have to make sure that whatever you're doing, you are doing it in an equitable fashion, that you're doing it consistently, that somebody can't say that, you're discriminating against one person over another, or you're not being fair because you're giving one thing to somebody and not the other. So as long as there's consistency in the way that you are administering things, bonuses are a great creative way. So as an example, the one that you just gave, giving somebody a year-end bonus, right, is wonderful because they then can have money to go buy holiday gifts or do with it whatever they want. A spot bonus is also a great way to recognize somebody. So if you have somebody that has been working really hard and has been working many hours to get a project done, and you really want to recognize them immediately for the contribution that they've just made, as opposed to waiting, till the next merit increase or whenever that compensation cycle is, you can give that spot bonus. If you have an employee who just recommended some great colleagues that you hired, you can give them a bonus for that. You can give a bonus for retention if you feel like there's been some attrition issues in the organization and you want to reward that. So bonuses are a great sort of creative way of rewarding employees, recognizing employees, and they don't have to be a lot of money. Sometimes it's a little goes a long way because they feel like, oh, somebody recognized me and they thought enough to give me this. It's sort of, it's a real thoughtful gesture sometimes, and it doesn't have to be sort of thousands of dollars. It just has to be meaningful where the employee feels that they were recognized in the right way. If you are, however, going to provide bonuses as part of performance, right, there's sort of 3 ways of looking at that. There's individual performance, there's team performance, and then there's the overall company performance, right? So organizations a lot of times say, we are going to give you a bonus. It's discretionary, but it could be depending on your level. It could be, 10%, 20%, 25% of your salary. But it's contingent upon sort of these 3 things: your own contribution. If the company has a team culture and they want to reward that team culture, it's also contingent upon how the team performs overall. And then also how those contributions sort of roll up into the organization at large. So the organization is going to put all this money into a pool and then bonus out at specific times of year the individuals. It could be quarterly, it could be annual, it could be, twice a year, whatever that cycle is. But that's why it's really important for everybody to understand what goes into that compensation. How are you determining the bonus? Why am I getting, 16,000 and Sally is getting 20 and we're in the same position? So the individual really needs to understand what are those things, what are those metrics, what are those KPIs, how is the organization evaluating these things in order to pay it out, and also what do they have to do to receive it, right? Sometimes you have people don't want to move because they're expecting that bonus and they want to get that bonus before they move. And again, that brings me to sign-on bonuses, right? Sometimes you have a great candidate and you want to bring them aboard and you want to bring them aboard today, but the candidate doesn't want to move because they're expecting some other compensation or there's something going on. So you say, well, we'll give you this sign-on bonus to sweeten the offer. It's a one-time bonus, but it'll bring on potentially the candidate quicker, or maybe, speed up whatever is going on, or consideration that the candidate doesn't want to leave money on the table. Mm-hmm. So that's the consideration with bonuses, right? Profit sharing is a little bit more complicated. Profit sharing is great because it allows the company sort of the flexibility of how they want to design that profit sharing plan. It's usually through an outside vendor because there's tax implications. And that's also a benefit because the organization can save on corporate taxes by contributing to that plan. They are the great thing about profit sharing plan, and it can be in conjunction with 401k plans or outside of 401k plans. They could figure out what kind of contributions they want to make. So if they're flush with cash one year, they could put in more contributions. If there's less, they may not put anything in, but it allows smaller organizations more flexibility, and it allows them to retain their employees because employees feel like they are a part of growing the organization and therefore a part of those profits along with the organization. The things to consider there, of course, is you want to make sure that you do some due diligence on your administrator. There are some administrative costs. There are things there's some administrative effort that has to go in that because you have to review that year over year. There's some filings like 5,500 for benefits that you now have to do. So there's I don't want to call them cons, but it's just there's a little bit more that employers really have to think about when they are sort of designing these types of plans. And then, of course, you get into giving employees stock, right? Because these are all private companies, and you're giving them some sort of option into the organization. And again, also you want to make sure that those types of plans are very, very concrete and spelled out, so employees know exactly what it means and how they would, how they would exercise those options at what point, what does that mean, and all of that. So there's education that comes with that as well as administration.
Okay. So that would probably encompass the question I had for you about legalities, about bonuses and profit sharing. That I think that's really important for people to know, where they do need to have some structure with the administration. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're going to go with these types of plan designs, you want them reviewed by an attorney. And if you're going to have any sort of complex, whether it's a commission plan or compensation plan, executive compensation plan, it's always a good idea to get it reviewed by attorneys. But, even smaller employers, there's many states right now that are enacting transparency laws, which essentially require that New York has it, Colorado has it, California, just to name three, that if you're posting a job even, and you're supposed to provide a salary range for that job, that range is supposed to be realistic. You can't say, $1,000 to $1 million in the range. It has to encompass something realistic. So in light of those laws, really understanding the pay structure, the pay scale, what the range of each position is becoming more and more important. And particularly because employees are now freer to discuss compensation, and that's why these laws were really enacted. You want to make sure that leadership and managers have a consistent story, that they're able to explain someone's compensation in relationship to someone else's. And you want to make sure that there's pay equity there, that you are using consistent practices when you are creating your compensation plans. So to the extent that you are communicating them appropriately and they're designed appropriately and written, it makes things a lot easier and it goes a long way.
Mm-hmm. Wow. A lot to think about with this. Are there times when someone should not offer incentive compensation?
So I think that there are, as an example, if you are going to be bringing on entry-level employees, I don't think that incentive compensation really plays a big role there. I think you pay them a salary. They know exactly what they're getting. Usually these are typically non-exempt employees. They're either hourly, and even if they're salary, it's sort of that entry level into the organization. You are investing a lot into them. Yes, they're going to be helping the organization, but it really is kind of that first rung. Incentive compensation doesn't necessarily play a very big role there. I'm also not a big proponent of giving incentive compensation if there's a lack of performance, right, on the individual level. And certainly if the company is not performing well, I don't think it's totally appropriate, right? Because it should all be tied to how the organization is doing and how the person is performing. And also it depends on what is happening with the organization. Obviously, if there's financial difficulties and you're planning on selling, those are things to potentially negotiate with the buyer to make sure that employees stay. And in that case, you might want to, again, engage some sort of incentive compensation as a retention if the business is going to be sold. But generally, I think incentive compensation is part and parcel of the overall strategy, and they're levers that you pull depending on what's going on with the business.
Okay. What do you think about commissions for team members that are involved in selling products and services in a business? Are there pros and cons with that?
I am a big proponent of commission plans for revenue sort of driving folks. I think they work best when they're hungry. I think their comp should be tied directly to the revenue that they bring. You don't want anybody in a sales role to kind of be resting on their laurels, because they're responsible directly for bringing in that additional revenue. So I've always been a big proponent of commission. You obviously have to pay some sort of base salary, and depending on role and depending on level and complexity, there's that base, but there should always be that commission to really sort of further that comp for revenue generating roles.
And does that go all the way up to the top level, like leadership of the revenue team?
It can. I've seen it both ways, but I've also seen it depending. I always say never be surprised by what you're incentivizing, right? So if you really have your chief revenue officer, I don't know to what degree you want to commission that person out, or whether you want to pay them a salary maybe and a bonus, because their responsibilities are much broader. And you want them to be responsible possibly not just for the straight revenue, but maybe even for your client service teams and how they're, and all of those metrics, client satisfaction, et cetera. So again, what behaviors? I always like to tie compensation back to behaviors. Mm-hmm. What behaviors are you trying to incentivize in the person this is the stuff that becomes really important.
Sure. Okay, it's such a complicated topic. When do you hire a compensation specialist to review your structure?
I think it depends on the inflection points of the business. Obviously, if the business has grown exponentially and now you have, you've doubled in size as an example, and you have many more employees and you want to make sure that your structure is equitable, that's definitely a time to review, right? If you have more than one person in the same role, you want to make sure that you are compensating in an equitable way. More so than that, if you know that you are going to be hiring a large group of people, you want to make sure maybe that you benchmark those positions, that you understand what that compensation structure is going to look like. So you want to do that preemptively, right? So if you know, hey, we're about to hire 20 new people in different markets, and we've never had these types of positions before, we want to go ahead and do a full-on analysis. That may also be a good time. So if you are planning, if you just had an M&A and again, there's an influx of individuals in the business, or frankly, if you've just grown organically and you've never really done it before, it's a good idea to do it and then to continually review it year over year as the business continues.
Okay. Well, that's really good to know. And how do you go about hiring a compensation specialist? What do you ask?
Yeah, you wanna ask what is their methodology? What sources are they using in order to do the analysis? What types of compensation structure do they think is going to be right for the organization, and why? How do they review, how do they review your job descriptions and understand leveling? How are they going to set up that system? What strikes them about what's going on in the organization? Have they obviously done that type of work before? What types of credentials do they have? If it's a consultant, you want to know what databases are they using? How are they benchmarking? If it's going to be an internal person that you're hiring, and this is a first-time hire, you want to know what types of surveys do they think that are going to be needed? What type of technology is going to be needed in order to run this analysis for the first time and then year over year? So you really want to get comfort that the person who you are hiring has done this type of work before and understands how to create that structure. Especially if you have salespeople, you want to make sure that they have worked with sales compensation plans before, executive compensation plans before, et cetera. So those are the considerations.
Okay. Well, let's end with 3 takeaways for our listeners. You've given us so many great nuggets, but if you were to pick out 3 things that you think are vital for them to take away, what would you say?
Yeah, don't take a narrow view of compensation. Look at it from a total rewards sort of vantage point. As I said before, those benefits, incentive comp, all of those things, that flexibility, all of those things to come together. And then also think about what are the things that are attractive about your business to someone, right? What is your employer proposition? And start developing that if you haven't. And then just always be consistent in whatever it is that you're doing, and make sure that you document, and communicate.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. This has been so enlightening. I appreciate your time today, and I will make sure that we get more information in our show notes about your company too.
Sounds great.
Thanks, Sarah, for joining Gail on the podcast this week. Compensation is a complex topic, and even with all of these points, we've just scratched the surface. To learn more about compensation, check out a brand new white paper on the topic from the CEO's right hand, linked in the show notes. Our 2024 Interior Design Industry Survey is available to take now. Lend your voice to this survey and secure your free copy when the results are available. To take the survey, visit thepearlcollective.com/takethesurvey.